The American judiciary has developed into an institution that generates its own binding rules, standards, and procedures, which function with the full force of law despite originating outside direct legislative enactment. These creations govern the interpretation of statutes, the availability of remedies, and the limits on accountability within the legal system. The constitutional framework assigns legislative power exclusively to Congress, yet the judiciary supplies the operative mechanisms that determine how laws are applied in practice. This self-generation produces a closed system in which the judiciary defines its own operational environment, leading to outcomes that reflect institutional priorities rather than strict fidelity to enacted statutes. The expansion of judge-made doctrines has inverted the relationship between the branches by allowing judicial policy to override or obscure legislative intent. Rules developed through precedent-controlled jurisdiction shield certain actors and establish barriers to relief. These doctrines operate independently of the legislative process, creating a parallel body of law that binds litigants and shapes societal expectations. The judiciary thus assumes a role that extends beyond interpretation into the creation of substantive and procedural norms, generating real legal consequences for individuals and institutions subject to its authority. This arrangement raises fundamental concerns about the authenticity of judicial output. When the judiciary applies standards it has itself invented, the process incorporates inherent tensions that undermine the impartiality and legitimacy required for valid adjudication. Decisions grounded in these self-created frameworks carry the weight of law while resting on foundations that lack the democratic pedigree of legislative action. The resulting structure perpetuates itself through incremental refinement, entrenching power within the judiciary and diminishing the constitutional balance among the branches. The judiciary as a self-regulating institution. The judiciary functions as a self-regulating entity that establishes its own precedents, due process requirements, and procedural mechanisms without reliance on statutes passed by the legislature. This autonomy allows the institution to craft internal guidelines that dictate how statutes receive interpretation and how constitutional provisions receive application. The self-regulation extends to the formulation of standards that manage docket flow, define access to courts, and determine the scope of remedies available to parties. Through this process, the judiciary creates an operational framework that governs its daily functions and the rights of those who appear before it. This self-regulation manifests in the judiciary's authority to refine and expand rules over successive cases, producing a body of doctrine that operates with binding effect. The institution thereby controls the conditions under which laws receive enforcement, often prioritizing considerations of judicial efficiency and continuity. The separation from direct legislative oversight enables the development of frameworks that insulate judicial processes from external correction. The judiciary thus operates not merely as an interpreter of law, but as the architect of the environment in which legal obligations receive definition and enforcement. Over time, this self-regulation generates a structural contradiction with the constitutional assignment of powers. The legislature enacts statutes intended to govern conduct, yet the judiciary supplies the detailed rules that determine their practical implementation. This division allows judicial standards to frustrate legislative purposes by introducing barriers or protections not contemplated in the original enactments. The institution advances its own continuity and authority through doctrinal elaboration that progressively solidifies its independent governance. The creation and function of stare decisis and procedural doctrines. Stare decisis operates as a judicial policy of adherence to prior decisions, established entirely through court rulings as a guiding principle rather than through legislative command. It binds lower courts to higher precedent and provides the Supreme Court with a framework for consistency, although the highest court retains the ability to depart when it deems necessary. This doctrine functions as a core mechanism for maintaining stability in legal outcomes while allowing controlled evolution through selective application. Its development through case law has embedded it deeply within the judicial process, shaping expectations across the legal system. Procedural doctrines encompass the rules governing civil and appellate proceedings, including those refined by the judiciary under delegated authority yet ultimately interpreted and expanded through judicial decision-making. These doctrines address matters of evidence, discovery, and appellate standards, creating detailed operational guidelines that control the flow of litigation. The judiciary has refined these rules to address perceived needs in case management, producing a comprehensive procedural architecture that binds all participants. The resulting framework operates with the force of law, determining the practical rights and obligations of litigants in every case. The combined effect of stare decisis and procedural doctrines creates a self-referential system in which the judiciary defines the conditions of its own legitimacy. Precedent cements earlier judicial choices, while procedural rules limit challenges to those choices. This interplay allows the institution to control the pace and scope of legal change, often favoring outcomes that preserve judicial discretion. The doctrines thereby function as de facto law, governing real-world disputes while originating solely from within the judicial branch. Qualified immunity and its judicial origins. Qualified immunity serves as a judge-created defense that protects government officials from civil liability unless they violate clearly established rights. The doctrine originated through successive Supreme Court decisions that introduced and refined the standard without textual support in the governing statutes. It has expanded to cover a wide range of official actions, creating a substantial barrier to accountability for conduct that might otherwise receive judicial scrutiny. The doctrine operates by requiring plaintiffs to demonstrate that the right in question was clearly established at the time of the alleged violation. The judicial origins of qualified immunity illustrate the pattern of doctrinal elaboration through case law. Courts developed the objective reasonableness test and related criteria to balance official functions against individual claims, producing a framework that functions independently of legislative text. This expansion has occurred incrementally across decades, with each refinement building upon prior rulings to broaden the scope of protection. The resulting standard now governs numerous civil rights actions, determining whether claims proceed to trial or receive dismissal. The application of qualified immunity demonstrates the judiciary's capacity to insert policy considerations into statutory schemes. By crafting this defense, the courts have effectively supplemented legislative enactments with judicial limits on liability. This insertion allows the judiciary to shape the practical enforcement of rights, often limiting remedies in ways that reflect institutional judgments about official conduct. The doctrine thereby exercises real legal authority over disputes involving government actors while deriving solely from judicial initiative. Standing requirements, abstention doctrines, and the political question doctrine. Standing requirements impose judge-developed criteria of injury in fact, causation, and redressability that parties must satisfy to gain access to federal courts. These standards extend beyond the constitutional language of case or controversy, creating additional prudential barriers that limit the types of claims courts will entertain. The doctrine functions to control the volume and character of litigation, allowing the judiciary to decline cases deemed unsuitable for judicial resolution. Its application determines whether individuals or groups receive a hearing on their claims. Abstention doctrines direct federal courts to refrain from adjudicating certain matters better suited to state proceedings or that risk interference with other governmental functions. These rules emerged through judicial decisions that established categories of cases in which federal involvement receives voluntary restraint. The doctrines preserve comity between federal and state systems while allowing the judiciary to manage its docket according to self-defined priorities. Their operation shapes the distribution of authority across the judicial landscape. The political question doctrine permits courts to decline adjudication of issues deemed committed to other branches, based on criteria developed entirely through judicial analysis. This standard enables the judiciary to avoid entanglement in matters of high policy or institutional sensitivity. The combined effect of standing, abstention, and political question doctrines creates multiple layers of judicial gatekeeping that control access to remedies. These frameworks operate as binding law, determining the availability of judicial power while originating from within the judiciary itself. Judicial review, Bivens actions, and additional judge-made standards. Judicial review represents the judiciary's assertion of authority to declare legislative and executive acts unconstitutional, established through early court decisions without explicit constitutional text. This power functions as a foundational element of the judicial role, enabling the institution to invalidate actions of the other branches. Its exercise has expanded over time to encompass a wide range of constitutional questions, shaping the boundaries of governmental authority. The doctrine operates as a core judicial standard with far-reaching legal effects. Bivens actions provide an implied remedy for damages against federal officials for constitutional violations, created through judicial decision-making rather than statutory enactment. The doctrine has undergone subsequent narrowing through further rulings that limit its scope. Additional standards include the exclusionary rule and its extensions, prophylactic measures such as Miranda warnings, and doctrines governing choice of law in diversity cases. These elements collectively form an extensive body of judge-made law that fills perceived gaps in statutory and constitutional frameworks. The proliferation of these standards demonstrates the judiciary's ongoing role in constructing its operational architecture. Each doctrine contributes to a comprehensive system that governs the enforcement of rights and the resolution of disputes. The judiciary thereby supplies the detailed rules that determine how broader legal principles receive practical application. This construction occurs entirely through precedent, producing binding norms that control outcomes across the legal system. The self-serving dynamics and escalation of institutional interests. The self-serving dynamics within the judiciary arise from the institution's capacity to craft rules that advance its own continuity and authority. Doctrines expand incrementally to reduce workload, enhance discretion, and limit exposure to external challenges. This pattern reflects institutional incentives that favor the accumulation of protective mechanisms over time. The resulting frameworks prioritize judicial efficiency and stability, often at the expense of broader accountability. Escalation occurs as each refinement builds upon prior rulings, creating a ratchet effect that solidifies self-serving features. Stare decisis entrenches these developments, making reversal difficult without explicit judicial acknowledgement of error. The judiciary interprets the statutes intended to constrain it, further insulating its creations from legislative correction. This dynamic produces an increasingly autonomous structure resistant to outside influence. The escalation perpetuates a cycle in which institutional interests gain precedence over external considerations. The judiciary refines its rules to manage internal pressures, generating doctrines that expand protections for government actors and limit judicial exposure. This process operates continuously, embedding self-serving elements more deeply with each generation of precedent. The institution thus advances its own power through doctrinal growth that appears incremental yet accumulates substantial authority. Conflicts of interest and the question of good faith in adjudication. Conflicts of interest emerge when the judiciary simultaneously creates, interprets, and applies its own rules, standards, and procedures. Judges function as both architects and enforcers of the frameworks that govern their decisions, producing an inherent tension that compromises the appearance and reality of impartiality. This dual role extends to the evaluation of claims involving government officials with whom the judiciary maintains regular institutional relationships. The resulting process incorporates structural bias that affects the neutrality of adjudication. The question of good faith arises when judicial standards contradict or supplement statutory text without clear authorization. The application of doctrines that lack direct legislative support raises concerns about fidelity to enacted law. Courts proceed under frameworks they have themselves constructed, even when those frameworks diverge from original legislative intent. This divergence undermines the authenticity of the adjudicative process, as decisions reflect judicial policy rather than strict statutory command. The combination of conflict and compromised good faith taints the legitimacy of judicial output. Decisions rendered under these conditions carry real consequences for litigants while resting on foundations that incorporate self-judging elements. The judiciary's control over the rules that define its own authority creates a closed loop that resists external scrutiny. This structure produces rulings that function as law yet originate from a process lacking the impartiality essential to constitutional adjudication. The potential invalidity of decisions relying on self-created rules. Judicial decisions grounded in self-created rules rest on unauthorized foundations that exceed the proper scope of judicial power. The Constitution assigns legislative authority exclusively to Congress, leaving the judiciary with the role of interpreting and applying enacted law. When courts generate binding standards and then adjudicate under them, the resulting actions qualify as ultra vires exercises that lack constitutional warrant. Decisions applying these doctrines derive from premises not rooted in legislative command. The invalidity extends to the collective and individual levels of judicial action. The entire system operates as a self-referential order in which precedent reinforces the initial overreach. Each judge who invokes a self-generated rule participates in the application of a framework lacking proper authorization. This participation compounds the defect, as rulings build upon one another to produce a body of law that functions independently of the legislative branch. The potential invalidity carries concrete ramifications for those subject to judicial authority. Litigants face denial of remedies or imposition of barriers based on standards originating within the judiciary itself. The process deprives judicial pronouncements of the legitimacy that flows from democratic enactment. Decisions therefore operate with practical effect while resting on defective premises that undermine their constitutional foundation. The imperative for legislative deference and restoration of constitutional balance. Legislative deference requires the judiciary to defer to Congress for the formulation of its own rules, standards, and procedures. This deference aligns with the constitutional separation of powers by restoring lawmaking authority to the elected branch. The judiciary would then apply statutes rather than generate the frameworks that govern their application. Such an approach eliminates the self-serving structures that currently insulate judicial processes from external control. Restoration of constitutional balance demands recognition that the judiciary's role does not encompass the creation of operative law. Congress possesses the tools to override or codify judicial doctrines, thereby reasserting its primacy in establishing binding rules. The judiciary would function within legislatively defined boundaries, reducing the conflicts inherent in self-regulation. This reorientation would realign institutional incentives toward faithful implementation of enacted law. Individual, organizational, and societal efforts advance agendas that address these structural issues. Individuals articulate the realities of judicial self-governance and propose solutions within existing institutions. Organizations network to implement policy changes through established channels. Societal mobilization, including the formation of broader coalitions, provides the scale necessary to influence institutional reform. These avenues enable the advancement of positions that seek to restore legislative supremacy and correct the imbalances created by judicial self-rule. Conclusion: the legitimacy crisis in American judicial self-governance and judge-made rules. The analysis demonstrates a profound legitimacy deficit within the current operation of the American judiciary. Judge-made rules, policies, and procedures function as law, shaping the enforcement of statutes and the resolution of disputes across the legal system. The self-serving character of the institution, combined with inherent conflicts of interest, produces decisions that lack full constitutional grounding. This situation requires acknowledgement of the structural problems embedded in judicial self-governance. The escalation of self-serving doctrines over time illustrates the limitations of internal checks within the judiciary. Without systematic deference to legislative authority, the system risks continued divergence from constitutional principles. The real legal ramifications for individuals subject to these rules highlight the necessity of addressing the inauthenticity present in many judicial pronouncements. Restoration of proper separation of powers entails recognition that the judiciary does not possess authority to create the rules under which it operates. By confronting the potential invalidity of decisions based on self-generated standards, the legal system can advance toward greater fidelity to legislative primacy. This reorientation strengthens the integrity of adjudication and realigns the branches in accordance with constitutional design.